Hello and welcome. I'm Carolyn, therapist and thanatologist. I'm really excited. We have a great guest here, someone who was at the ADEC conference in Houston this year, the Association of Death Education Counseling. And this is also something new, something we haven't really done on our podcast yet. We're going to be, well, I don't want to spoil it. So I'm going to introduce Elizabeth McLean, also known as Libby, is how I'm going to be referring to you. And welcome. I'm so excited.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So I'm going to go ahead and read your bio, and then we're going to jump in. So Elizabeth Libby McLean, MA, is a third-year clinical psychology doctoral student at Texas Tech University. She studies non-bereavement loss and grief, and is specifically interested in the grief experience of family members of incarcerated persons. She hopes to continue to pursue this work through her research and clinical work following the completion of her PhD. Um, so welcome. So you gave a presentation at ADEC, which I think is just so important. And again, so to everybody listening, we're actually shifting a little bit out of death and dying as we all kind of imagine it. And as we said, you called it non-bereavement loss and grief, right?
Yeah.
Um, Before we jump in, do you want to mention anything else about that? That
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm really excited to see where the field is going, and that we're starting to see some more recognition of the kinds of losses and the kind of grief that people can experience even when someone has not died. I think, we're starting to see some of that. I mean, post-COVID, where people had all kinds of losses they were experiencing that weren't necessarily death, but we're seeing a lot of the same kind of themes come up that someone has when they're grieving a death. And so just overall, I'm really excited to see the field moving in that direction. And obviously that's a big interest of mine, which kind of brought me here. So
I'm glad you said that too, because I do want to point out, I do think this is kind of an evolution of grief therapy and our understanding of grief. We're really using these non-death losses, which I know we'll talk about more. And again, this is kind of evolution. We're learning and growing as therapists and in this field. So this is really exciting stuff, actually, new and exciting. So I do want to mention you also are the first author on two papers, not articles, which we'll talk about a little more, but I just wanted to name those. And you wrote these with three other authors. Perceptions of Grief Reactions in Family Members of Incarcerated Individuals, a vignette-based experiment, and Perceptions of Crime Severity and Stigma toward Family Members Grieving the Loss of a Person to Incarceration. I just wanted to name those titles, and then I know we're going to refer to those. So do you want to kind of start with giving us a little bit of background, scope of this?
sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, the scope of incarceration in the United States broadly is really kind of hard to comprehend. So the US has the largest prison population in the world. It's actually the largest of really any developed country. And so with that, we have about 1.2 million people who are currently incarcerated in the US. But when we think about, okay, that's the number of people who are currently incarcerated, but for each of those 1.2 million people, how many family members do they have left behind? And that was really kind of what got me is thinking about the scope of the family members and the sheer number of people who are impacted by this incarceration. Um, and to qualify that even further for just kind of how common this experience is, about 45% of US adults have had an incarcerated family member at some point. So that's nearly half.
Yeah.
And again, when you kind of just put that into perspective of the millions and millions of people who are impacted by incarceration, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around. So that was kind of the sheer enormity of that, I think, is important to note in any conversation we have about this, because it's something that I don't think a lot of people have considered, really, is some of the family members who are kind of left behind following the incarceration.
Absolutely. I mean, when I read that, the 45% of all adult that, like, it's almost half, right? I mean, so this is really something that impacts millions and millions and millions and millions of people. So really important. And I have to say, I learned something new. I think a lot of people don't know that. I really think it's so really important work that you're doing here.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, um, it's been really exciting, really, I'm really amazing getting to work with some of these family members and hear some of their experience as well, because, you know, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit later when we get into it, but many family members do feel very forgotten about, and do feel very much like their grief is not recognized. So again, I'm glad to see the field kind of moving in this direction, and I'm at least trying to do my part by reaching out to these family members and identifying that what they're experiencing, you know, might be grief, and how we might be able to approach that from everything we know from the death and dying and thanatology literature.
Yeah. Well, how did you start getting into this research or yeah. Let us-
Yeah, no. So I was really lucky as an undergraduate. I went to the University of Nevada, Reno. And in my time there, I worked in a few different labs, one of whom was the lab of Dr. Anthony Papa. And so he goes by Tony. Tony really introduced me to kind of the field of grief and loss literature. And actually, one of his graduate students, Dr. Jonathan Singer, at the time a graduate student, now he is actually my advisor in grad school, is really kind of what led me at least into the world of grief, bereavement, death, dying. But specifically, Tony did some work on how non-death, non-bereavement losses like job loss and divorce actually can lead to some of these reactions that we see in folks who have lost someone via death. And that was just really striking to me at the time, that somebody could actually experience grief, you know, when nobody necessarily has died. Someone might even still physically be alive, but, you know, through divorce is no longer in your life. And at the time, I was also very interested in correctional psychology. I tend to take a very social justice perspective on a lot of my work, and so very interested in the kind of impact of incarceration on many different systems. And so those two kind of came to me sort of married together in a way, right? Where it was, okay, this is an identified loss of losing someone to incarceration. Might that also lead to a grief response? So kind of came up with that early on in sort of my career. And then some really great work did come out in 2020 as well by Kelly King and Heather Delgado. I want to say Dr. King is at UC Davis and Dr. Delgado is, I think, at Auburn University. And they wrote a paper looking at incarceration from a grief lens. And so they kind of laid a lot of the foundation for where I was going. So.
Wow, yeah. Um, okay. And I did want to add, so the research you did, I just wanted to say, focuses on adults, not the kids, right?
Correct. Yes. Yeah. So there is other work in this field that has taken some look at I think a greater attention to looking at kiddos who are experiencing the loss of a parent to incarceration. But the adult literature is pretty bare. So that's mostly where I work.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I just wanted to talk about that. So let's go a little bit into, the literature search or your papers, or kind of delve into that a little.
Yeah. Well, obviously, kind of getting started in grief, loss, bereavement literature, led me to our our royalty in the grief world, so to speak, right? Dr. Holly Prigerson, of course, all of her work on prolonged grief was a big part of me kind of learning about the field.
I say our living legends, but I like royalty. That works too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and then obviously the work of, I mean, Pauline Boss and Ken Doka, Darcy Harris, kind of all of these folks who had really laid a lot of the foundation for how all of these concepts might kind of come together. So, really dug into the literature there, dug into disenfranchised grief, into ambiguous loss, into prolonged grief, but also the work of George Bonanno was really influential for me as well, looking at resilience, to trauma, to bereavement, all these different kinds of things. So yeah, our living legends certainly helped me kind of conceptualize how some of this might come together.
Yes, and I'll just, pause for a second. So yes, Holly Prigerson is wonderful, and a lot of the work that she had done, her research, I should say, I think is the prolonged grief disorder criteria. She contributed to that, as did George
I believe,
Bonanno,
yes.
and he worked, I think, with here at Columbia.
Mhm.
Yeah, so the both of them contributed to that. I am going to give a shout out to, so when you talked about this is my signed book from Pauline.
Wow.
So I did an in-person workshop with her a long time ago. She's pretty old now. But I know that her work started with children. She mentioned in the workshop, that I did with her, and I know she had done her when she was doing her research. I think in the 70s, she did mention working with kids who had an incarcerated parent. So some of the ambiguous loss themes come from that, but like we were saying, she was more focused on children, not adults, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, obviously Dr. Boss's work really changed some of the way that we approach loss, and this idea that loss is like a discrete event that, happens and then it's over with. And I think that that really helps characterize some of the experience of having someone who is incarcerated, because it is ongoing. It is, not something that you reach kind of closure on in the way that some people might think you can with a loss via death, which we also know that that's not always necessarily something people, have to reach closure on. But I just think that her work really highlighted that in a way that obviously people hadn't thought about before. So yeah, very, very seminal, very important in a lot of the work that I'm doing.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna do a quick definition. So from her book and from her work, ambiguous loss, there's two definitions, and we're gonna work with the first one today. The person is perceived as physically absent, but psychologically present, right? So physically, the person might be incarcerated, or I remember when I learned it, it could be a parent that's overseas, they're in the military, we know they're still alive somewhere in the world, but they're not present, right? And then we won't talk about it today, but the other definition is the opposite. The person is psychologically absent, but physically present, and that's more for Alzheimer's or brain injury. But anyway, I just wanted to define ambiguous loss for everybody listening. I also wanted to just define disenfranchised grief, which is Ken Doka, right? A living legend. I met him twice. I know I'm just name dropping.
It's like meeting a rock star. Yeah.
But disenfranchised grief is really just grief not recognized by society, right? I don't know if you want to add something to that definition.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that really does capture so much of it. And I think the way too that disenfranchised grief theory has been applied, even kind of above and beyond, Ken Doka's work, is some of the stigma associated with the grief response too, and folks trying to reach out for support or for help and just not receiving it. And I see that so much, obviously, in this work that I'm doing.
Stigma, you're right. And that's really important. Thank you for adding that, because you're right. It's the stigma that's what's so difficult about it. And then maybe we just briefly define Darcy Harris. She had, her definition of non-death loss. She has two. I like her second one. Non-death loss have the potential to shatter one's assumptive world. And when I'm training other therapists, I just think that's so sustain. It shatters someone's assumptive world. So it can be anything, certainly when the person dies, but any kind. You had mentioned divorce or job or these kinds of things. So I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
No, I mean that I really think, yeah, captures it and just opens up our perspective of loss from only considering death as being a loss that someone can grieve or that can kind of shatter someone's world. Yeah, I think that just about captures it. It's hard to put it any better than that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, do you want us to talk a little more about your qualitative interviews?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for my master's thesis, here at Texas Tech, one of my big goals within this work is to, kind of give us we have the foundation theoretically for why all these things work together, to create this potential grief response that might happen, but beyond that we don't yet have a clear understanding of what exactly does that grief look like. How is it different? How is it similar, to grieving a loss via death, because ultimately, right, in kind of clinical psychology, our goal is to gather all this information, gather all this data, and then find interventions that might be able to help. So that was kind of my biggest goal, was using qualitative work, lived experience of folks who do have a family member who's incarcerated, and using that information to build a theoretical model for what that specific grief experience looks like. So this was work that I did, starting in, let's see, May of 2023, and then concluded interviews, let's see, probably in December or so of last year. So we interviewed for not quite a year. And we recruited folks from support groups for family members of incarcerated persons, online ads, Reddit groups, all kinds of things, trying to find folks who would be willing to share a little bit about their experience with me. And that was, I mean, just incredible, just amazing getting to talk to these folks, hear their perspective, and ended up with, I think, a really fruitful, again, kind of derived from lived experience model that I'm really excited to talk with you a little bit more about today. So.
Wow. When I have a question, I mean, I'm a therapist, not a researcher. To me, I would imagine that those must have been kind of sad, some of those.
Yeah. I mean, I had to separate, right, unfortunately, a little bit some of my clinical brain, knowing that maybe wasn't the exact purpose of that person getting on the call with me. But some of these stories are so heartbreaking. And our system is incredibly flawed, to put it lightly. And so some of the experiences that folks reported to me, I mean, of just really kind of spurious rules that sometimes applied and sometimes didn't for when they'd be able to visit their loved one. The sheer cost of phone calls, the sheer cost of video calls, the distance that people are driving to go visit their loved one. I mean, it's really, again, kind of hard to wrap your head around the extent to which people's lives are impacted by this. And so, yeah, I mean, very, very sad, very, I think, enlightening, again, for me, even, who kind of had some ideas going in, but being able to hear this from folks who have had this experience, just very, very important to get some of these voices out there.
Yeah. So can you kind of share some of the Because you said model. So what was the next kind of step after you did your interviews?
Yeah, so anyone who's ever done qualitative data analysis knows it's no one will ever listen to you better than someone who is transcribing what you're saying word for word and rereading it over and over again. So yeah, it's a really interesting process. It's an iterative process where I had an amazing team working with me of some fellow graduate students. So I want to shout out a couple folks in my lab, Carol Fadala and Lauren Elliott, who did some amazing work helping me to code some of this work. And then basically looking at these codes, so these kind of lines of script that people are saying that we attribute a certain word to. So, maybe the code is longing, right? So, and we code a phrase that sounds like somebody who is longing. And we basically take all those codes, compile them all together, and through kind of iterative reading, rereading, revisiting, the original text, you kind of end up with some of these themes that we ended up deriving to describe sort of an overall framework that captured some of the most frequently referenced experiences from participants.
Mm. Can you share some of those with us?
Some of the quotes or some of the
Oh,
themes?
no, just the themes or kind of yeah.
Yeah, I would be happy to. And I think that also for our purposes, this is probably where you can bring the slide up for this. So yeah, we ended up basically with what I identify as like a systems model. And so that really means that the individual is situated within this larger system. It's kind of similar to like Bronfenbrenner's bioecological theory, where there are these kind of more macro level systems that impact the individual. And so the reason I conceptualized it this way, and I'll get into the exact themes, but this is kind of how these things all come together, is because the carceral system is a system. And so when I was thinking about how all of these things fit together, I don't think that we can really separate the individual experience from the system in which it occurs. And so with that, where we ended up was kind of this model where incarceration specific factors is kind of the most outward system within which we're dealing, right? Because the prison system is where all of these other things are taking place.
Yeah.
And so within that, we had several themes that were really kind of specific to the experience of losing someone to incarceration, one of which being visitation, right? And how that's a very unique experience in this loss context compared to other kinds of loss contexts. Take, for example, to quote, Dr. Boss's work, where if someone has been kidnapped, right, there isn't that level of, you can't communicate with them, you can't visit them, but with someone who is incarcerated, you can. But even with that, there are certain difficulties associated with that that might then impact the grief experience that maybe you're having. And then, another theme within that is, for example, like anger at the system came up quite a bit, where folks are feeling angry at law enforcement, angry at the prison system, angry at how all of these things are designed to then kind of, again, impact how they're doing and impact their grief experience that they might be having. And so all of these things kind of in my mind start to taper down into how does it ultimately experience the emotional, or excuse me, how does it ultimately influence the emotional experience of the individual? So those were a couple of the first themes, but then within that broader theme, we had cascading losses. And so under that theme, we had some themes of like loss of communication, loss of control, loss of time with the person, the milestones they might experience, losing friends and family who maybe don't want to be associated with the incarcerated person anymore, et cetera. And then again, kind of the idea being is how does each of those pieces then kind of trickle down and influence the grief experience someone might be having?
As soon as you started, the word like lack of control is one of the things that really came up for me before you even mentioned it. This is a really, and in some losses, it is true, we don't have control, but it feels like this one, because we're in this, like you said, this system, it feels, like in general, like end of life, there are things we can't control, but we're not necessarily, especially I did home hospice, so people are at home, and I mean, there's certain things you can't always control, but generally you're in your home, you're in your community, right? But this, like you said, you're in this, and not only is it a system, like a school is a system, but it's a controlled system. A prison is really a controlled system more than a school or a hospital or I'm a social worker, and social workers work in other settings, right? But that setting is, you have no control and you have no voice, I feel like, too, which, we try to give people voices in schools or, some of these other settings, right? So that piece of it, I don't know, I'm just kind of focusing on how frustrating and difficult that piece must be.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, some of my participants even talked about having the loss of control associated with having to entrust their family members' medical care to the prison and having to relinquish any control that they might have over the care that they're getting, or yeah, the food that they're eating. I mean, having to kind of let go of any control they might have over their safety. I mean, it really is, it's this kind of all-encompassing system where, I mean, family members are just left very much on the outside of anything that happens to their loved one inside.
Mhm. So, and then you also, I mean, we touched on the word stigma. And do you want to talk a little bit about how you said, friends and family, I think this kind of loss probably is disenfranchised because it carries more stigma than a lot of other kind of losses, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, I think we've made better strides as a society in understanding some of the more systemic problems that contribute to mass incarceration. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it is not a kind of quote unquote universal experience in the way that death is.
Right.
Um, and so that's kind of where, yeah, that stigma piece comes in is, I think I would like to believe as a society, we're getting better at understanding that, just because somebody has a loved one in prison, just because somebody goes to prison, that there is a lot that leads up to that, that are mitigating factors for that stigma, but it's still very prevalent. And so that was something that did come up is folks did report, perceiving a lot of stigma from others, in particular, family members of individuals who've committed sexual offenses experience immense disenfranchised grief. Um, and I think that stigma piece is still there for these family members, such that they're not able to engage in some of the kind of social kind of support, right, that we might with other kinds of losses. So yeah, absolutely. It came up with a lot of my participants, and I think will be a pretty key part into figuring out how we can reach out and help some of these family members cope with this loss.
Mhm. So after you really spend a lot of time listening to people and going through, and then it sounds like you found kind of these themes, broader themes. Is that the right way to say
Yes. Yeah.
it? Then did you start to look at models of grief, or what was the next step after that?
Yeah, yeah. So we're still kind of in that piece of it, for where to take this project next. Again, it was important for us to get a really clear kind of theoretical understanding, at least from a research perspective, because then we can take this information and we can develop, questionnaires, measures to try to understand some of this experience. We can kind of disseminate that a little bit more broadly, to further add to some of the evidence base so that we can take this, and move into more of like an applied intervention place. But to follow up on specifically kind of how did we use other grief models with this, I do want to bring up kind of the way that disenfranchised grief and ambiguous loss have influenced some of the model. Again, obviously our living legends to kind of pay homage there. We recently did a scoping review, which is currently under review at a for a journal. And in part of that scoping review, we basically looked at all the literature that has been published so far on grief related to incarceration. And so what we found from that is, sort of predictably so, right, that a lot of the work used frameworks related to ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief. But when I kind of started conceptualizing what this model was going to be, I realized that for all the strengths that disenfranchised grief and ambiguous loss have, I felt like ultimately for this project, they both captured kind of only a piece of the larger experience. And so part of where we want to take this now is there is certainly some uncertainty, ambiguity, kind of, again, this ongoing nature of the loss, which is very ambiguous loss. But there's also other parts of the loss that I don't think are quite captured as much by that theory, not because of any weakness within ambiguous loss as a theory, but just because this is, in my mind, a specific loss experience that has specific elements to it. And then similar with disenfranchised grief, right? Where there is obviously a piece of disenfranchised grief in here, but I think part of where I kind of would like to go is in some ways decentering our talks about stigma from some of this conversation, because I do think sometimes stigma is very much implied or inferred when that may or may not be the experience someone is having. And I think if we continue to talk about the stigma of things and talk about things in a stigmatized kind of framework where that's very central to the core idea, how do we ever kind of move away from that being the one focus? And how do we move beyond that in our conversations about that might be a piece of it? And so many of these family members, even with this stigma piece, we're still talking about the support they had. We're still talking about all the positives in their life. We're still talking about how they had social support in other areas. And I think like that's a real strength. So how can we this piece is important, but how can we decenter it a little bit to move more into, and what can we do about it, right? So those are kind of some of the things we're thinking right now, is how to take both of those, seminal theories, and take the pieces that I think they've really laid out for us, but how then can we kind of expand? So that was a long-winded answer to your question, but
No, I love it. One of the things that I always say is, we are always evolving, therapy's evolving, therapists are evolving, research is evolving. And so we start with, our living legends and the work they did, and we want to evolve and grow, that's one of the reasons I like to do this podcast, is because I feel like I'm meeting people who I think are doing like cutting edge work, which, it just people like you and doing things out in the world that sometimes takes a while to kind of ripple down into, when we're training a therapist or social worker, which is fine. That's how it goes, right? And it's so interesting what you said, because I do think it is important for us to be aware of disenfranchised grief, certainly, and to name it. Years ago, it's changed a lot, and I'm in New York, but especially for gay couples, in home hospice, that was very disenfranchised, very, very, and it's changed in hopefully many places. But it was a really important thing that we had an understanding as clinicians with the people we were working with, right? But I hear you very clearly. We want to work from a strengths-based perspective. And sometimes overemphasizing that may not be a strengths-based perspective, right?
yeah.
So that's something we need to weigh and look at. And I feel like you're maybe we're evolving it or taking it to a new place, or maybe what is the bridge between, okay, that's where it is, where is that empowerment or strength-based perspective or place to work from, which I think is really important, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. Any
Thank you.
thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I completely agree where it's, you know, validating that what folks are experiencing is, is a disenfranchised experience from the larger pool of society. And I think coming from like a kind of disenfranchised grief informed perspective. But I think sometimes what I've kind of seen with these family members is also that is one piece of their entire puzzle, their entire narrative throughout this process. And so I think, okay, well then why don't we make that exactly what it is, one piece? And then I'm very much a fan of strengths-based perspectives because I mean, throughout all of the interviews that I did, I mean, there were so many strengths that these folks had, so much resilience, so many things they were doing for themselves. And I just think particularly in disenfranchised communities, the community knows best. And ultimately, I'm such a fan of being able to connect this back to what strengths do you have in your community in order to help you through this, rather than just looking at, is this kind of a quote unquote deficit, that a lot of kind of in like the ivory tower of academia, right? And how these kinds of things can be framed, I think, to folks in some of these communities, is that it's all deficit, it's all weakness based. And I'm very much a fan of kind of decentering that perspective a little bit.
I mean, that reminds me, in hospice, the social worker does the biopsychosocial, spiritual, financial, and part of that, like you said, it's strengths and weaknesses, what's working and, what can we help bolster for the family. But like you said, they often have their own, what is it that the family does have? What are the strengths? Is it, often in New York, in some of our Black communities, they would say my church family, and they had a, so these kind of things that were supportive. So we looked at everything,
Yeah.
right? And then what were the things that maybe they needed some support where that was our
Yeah.
job, but the other things were working. So no, I think that's really interesting what you said about the disenfranchised group. I like what you're saying when you say that it is a piece of it, because I certainly, again, I feel that we have to work with people holistically. And to do that, we have to do, I'm this biopsychosocial, spiritual, fine. Even if you're not doing that, it's a more holistic approach to see them as a whole person,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And I think that maybe there's a piece in what you're saying. So it's true, ambiguous loss might not cover everything. And again, we can evolve some of these models, right? Um, are you able to share with us some of the pieces that either some of the shortcomings from ambiguous loss or some of the missing pieces?
Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the things with ambiguous loss theory is just that it wasn't developed specifically for this experience, right? That wasn't its purpose. And so the foundational aspects are there, like I said, where it really enabled us to see, okay, what happens when loss is not a discrete finite event that happens and then it's over. But I also think that there are several aspects of incarceration specifically that just aren't quite captured. And this isn't even, again, in a problem specifically with ambiguous loss. It's just I don't think other people have really looked at this yet. But is how does visitation play into the framework? Does it I could see many different arguments theoretically. Maybe it makes, this kind of boundary ambiguity worse for people where, sometimes they are there physically and then sometimes they're not. Or how do we kind of capture and talk about even folks who are on some kind of supervised release, whether that is probation or parole or house arrest, even where there are still losses associated with that. But then maybe that pushes us more into a, physical presence and psychological absence, and just kind of how these different things of sort of being involved in the system, being incarcerated, how I think that there are some intricacies within ambiguous loss theory that have yet to kind of be explicated in this sense. So that's kind of, again, it's less so necessarily that ambiguous loss theory has significant shortcomings, but just more so that I think there are elements of this loss specifically that just can go a little deeper to kind of fully explore how that might apply.
Yeah, and I hear what you're saying, because these are all unique. This kind of non-death loss would be different from, of course, divorce, or they're
Yeah.
all they're different. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, well, I was wondering if we wanted to shift for a minute, and we can go back to this, but there's this intersection of psychology, crime, and law. And before I was introduced to your work, I didn't know anything about this. And I was like, oh my gosh, whoa, this is a new concept. So I love interdisciplinary approaches. Thanatology is a very interdisciplinary approach. I worked in hospice for many years, which is absolutely, our team is interdisciplinary. So I'm big on that. And this was something interdisciplinary I didn't know anything about. Um, I don't know. Can you tell us more? Psychology, crime, and law.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Gosh, I mean, this could be a podcast in and of itself, because there's a lot. So I guess I'll start broad, and then I'll kind of get a little more, I think, into the more specific kind of area that at least I inhabit. Because I think a lot of the time when people hear psychology, crime, and law, they instantly think of like Criminal Minds, the TV show, right? Or or the show Mindhunter, right? And thinking about like the FBI in the 70s kind of profiling serial killers and that sort of thing. And that was obviously part of it. But really the field is much broader and more diverse than that now. So there are different ways to kind of marry psychology and crime and law. There's a big movement of forensic assessment, looking at folks and whether or not they might be competent to stand trial, or doing psychological evaluations for individuals who are on probation to get them connected to different treatment services. There's also research just in sort of psychology broadly about criminal thinking and how can we intervene with folks who have engaged in past criminal criminal activities, but how can we kind of redirect from there. But really a lot of that work, and rightfully so, right? I mean, our incarcerated folks are a vulnerable population within this country, and any assistance that we can provide them is more than warranted, and where a lot of resources should be devoted, in my opinion. But that is, again, kind of one piece of things. And so there is a much smaller body of literature, but some folks are out here trying to do the work of working with families, working with children who are also impacted by incarceration, which is kind of a different approach. Right. So a lot of the work working with folks who are involved in the system is recidivism, risk assessment, treatment within the carceral system. How do we get interventions to people? What does being incarcerated do to someone's mental health, et cetera? But really, this kind of piece with how other people are impacted by the incarceration is more so where I live, and that is a much smaller kind of interdisciplinary field, but that I really look forward to seeing grow. And a lot of people are looking at it more from a clinical counseling perspective of incarceration of a family member as trauma, and how do we look at that through a trauma-informed lens. And then obviously the work where I'm looking at it through is kind of a grief perspective. How can we look at this as a loss? Can we treat this in similar ways as we might try to support someone as they're experiencing grief, et cetera? So hopefully that kind of answered the question. There's a lot to sum it all up in psychology, crime, and law.
Well, no, it is a lot. And I hear what you're saying because there's a big piece of it that's for the incarcerated person or a lot of literature. But then, as you're saying, children or family members affected by it. And I wonder if it's if working particularly with kids, maybe who've experienced someone, a family member being incarcerated, is really like a early intervention is not the right word, but it's like we need to kind of get those support systems in place to whether it's, I mean, grief or trauma to really kind of support these kids or younger people. Right.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is, an adverse childhood experience. It is an ACE to have a family member incarcerated, and it's a risk factor for kiddos to, move through the system themselves, or it's a risk factor for, different health complications, for different, mental health diagnoses, et cetera. So it really, its impact extends so far beyond the incarcerated person themselves. And I think that that's where some people are starting to kind of gain momentum a little bit in that area, is, oh, this is an even bigger problem than we originally thought.
It was interesting. I was talking to a social worker friend who works with teens who are incarcerated. And and I was saying like, oh, grief and da da da. And she was like, I work with grief. All of these kids have gone through so much and so many different and we were like, oh yeah. And some of it might have actually been a death loss, but it's a lot of non-death loss that a lot of these teens have gone through, that and I don't know if there's really that lens. I mean, maybe, but really using that lens or using a model for therapists and social workers who are in that space. I know it's a little bit different than what you're talking about, but really, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, I think, and again, kind of to your point, right, where some of this work is happening, but it doesn't always trickle down, or it takes many years to trickle down to actually boots on the ground folks who are doing this work. And that's, I mean, honestly, part of why I was so excited to get your email to come on this podcast is just like get the word out, and kind of get people talking about it, outside of academia, where obviously I am right now, but I am just such a fan of kind of working together across interdisciplinary work, really, to get some of this information out there. So yeah, that was part of why I was so excited to come on today.
Yeah, no, thank you. It is this interesting idea because when we talk about non-death loss and divorce or incarceration or miscarriage, this lens of a non-death loss is not that it's new because people are kind of doing this work, but I think it can be new working with clients, like, yeah, yeah. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I think just that, it was interesting in some of the qualitative work that I did, where, you know, framing it for people at the very end, after all the questions were done, and we, didn't think that we would be biasing anybody anyway. We did kind of frame it as, do you think that this was a grief experience? Does that capture what you experienced? And I want to say, maybe I won't put a number to it because I don't want to say the incorrect number. A lot of participants indicated that their experience was similar to grief. And some participants were even able to kind of cite back to experiences of death that they had, and to say, yes, this was the same, or this was worse in some ways. And so I think labeling that for people and naming that for people did kind of, for some folks, give them language to describe what they were experiencing, because they're like, it's beyond sadness, it's beyond missing a person. I mean, it is that yearning, that longing for that person to be back. It's so much larger, I think, than some of the vocabulary folks had to describe it before. And so yeah, I agree that I think it gives client work a new way to describe things.
Yeah, yeah. Was there any anything else particular that you wanted to add from doing the interviews, or anything else?
Yeah, I honestly, I think the main thing I want to add, I guess, to just kind of shout out really the participants who contributed to this work. I'm just so thankful for their time, and I'm so thankful for everyone who's taken an interest in this work, including yourself, because I do think it's so important to get this work out there, to have people talking about this from a different perspective. And so, yeah, I've been really quite fortunate in the experiences I've had so far, with what everyone has been willing to share with me, and also just the support I've gotten from mentors along the way. So that's what I wanted to add.
Mm. No, thank you. I mean, we're going to wrap up in a minute, and I don't want to open a can of worms here. But I think grief can continue. A a friend of mine, someone I grew up with, is doing a lot of work with formerly incarcerated folks who, I think a lot of them are trying to get their voting rights back. And so that's another law. I mean, I don't know that much about it. I'm just speaking off the cuff here, but I know that people are doing that kind of work. And so I would think that's another, what were the losses now? Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. Yes, that is certainly another area worth exploration, because exactly to your point, even when the person is home again, if they're able to return home again, is are we really just kind of going back to normal? Probably not, for reasons that you indicated, with voting rights, or even access to housing. If folks have to do some work in transitional housing, if there are any kind of long-lasting implications with even children, depending on what the offense was. And so the losses do not end necessarily after the person is home. I mean, even requiring that folks self-identify as having committed a felony for job applications, right? So yeah, I would certainly think that we would continue to see losses, and different kinds of grief responses throughout that experience as well. But I don't have data to support it yet, but I would think so.
And then I would, yeah. And then, I think it must be really hard for a family member when that person comes back to watch them going through all of this.
Oh yeah, yeah, and it's, you're trying to integrate back into your life together, but again, I mean, for some of these folks too, we're talking decades of time apart, and then what happens when that person is home? What is that experience like? And so yeah, I absolutely think that that is another part of this research that is just not taken on as of yet.
Mhm. Yeah, well, there's so many different aspects and parts to it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. Anything else you wanted to add that we missed, that I forgot, that is important?
gosh, I don't think so. No, I don't think so. Yeah, just, yeah, thank you for the opportunity to come on and share.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. You are a plethora of information. You're doing amazing work. I can tell you're really passionate about it, and you really like this. You really care about this work and working with this population.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I do. This is something that I really feel I've kind of found my calling in. So I really look forward to continuing to do the work.
Well, you're very well spoken about it. You did an amazing job. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
And thank you for everybody for listening. And we will see you on the next episode. Thank you.